It started as a perfect night. The air was thick with the warmth of summer, the faint scent of freshly cut grass lingering as James Carter walked along the edge of his private pool. The water shimmered beneath the soft glow of the patio lights, casting playful reflections against the surrounding stone. This was his sanctuary, his escape from the constant grind of the outside world. After years of hard work, he had finally bought his dream home in an upscale neighborhood, a place where he could find peace. He reached for the latch on the pool gate, ready to lock up for the night, when the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted his quiet moment. He barely had time to turn before a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the stillness. "What do you think you're doing here?" James blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Standing in front of him, arms crossed and eyes burning with suspicion, was Karen. He had seen her before, everybody had. She was the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, always watching, always judging. The kind of woman who prided herself on enforcing rules that didn't exist. James exhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. "Excuse me?" Karen tilted her head, her expression dripping with condescension. "This pool is for residents only. You need to leave." James stared at her for a moment, then let out a quiet, disbelieving chuckle. "Lady, this is my property." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've lived here for 10 years, and I've never seen you before. How do I know you belong here?" James had heard stories about people like her, neighbors who seemed to think their presence alone determined who had the right to exist in their space. He squared his shoulders, unwilling to entertain her nonsense. "I live here. This is my home." But Karen wasn't listening. Instead, she pulled out her phone, tapping at the screen with furious determination. "Then prove it to the police." James felt his stomach tighten as she pressed the call button. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew exactly how this would play out. She stepped back, speaking into the phone with a quiver in her voice that hadn't been there seconds ago. "Yes, I need an officer at the community pool immediately. There's a man here, he's acting aggressive, refusing to leave. I don't feel safe." James clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. Acting aggressive? He hadn't moved an inch, yet Karen had slipped effortlessly into full victim mode. The calm, collected woman standing before him had suddenly transformed, her voice laced with manufactured fear. A quiet dread settled in his chest. He had seen stories like this before, a white woman calling the police on a black man, twisting the situation in real time to make herself look like the victim. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights painted the street, reflecting off the water's surface in eerie streaks. 2 officers stepped out of their squad car, their expressions unreadable as they approached. Karen let out a breath of exaggerated relief. "Thank God you're here. He wouldn't leave, and I was so scared." James stood still, arms crossed, forcing himself to stay calm as one of the officers approached. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, keeping his movements slow, controlled. He handed over his ID, then motioned toward the house behind him. "This is my property. I live here. She's the one trespassing." The officer glanced between James and Karen, then flipped through the ID, nodding slowly. "Do you have proof of ownership?" James was ready. He stepped toward the poolside table and grabbed the folder he had been reviewing earlier, his mortgage documents, deed, everything with his name on it. He handed them over, waiting as the officers examined the papers. A heavy silence fell. Karen's arms slowly dropped to her sides as she watched one of the officers clear his throat. "Everything checks out," he said, handing the papers back to James. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. That can't be right." "Are you sure?" The second officer shot her a look of growing impatience. "Ma'am, this is his property. There's no crime here. If you continue to harass him, we'll have to file a report against you." James watched as Karen's face darkened. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, the refusal to accept that she had lost. Instead of apologizing, she took a step back, voice laced with venom. "This isn't over." And with that, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the night. James let out a slow breath as the officers left, the flashing lights fading down the street. He should have felt relief, but instead, a nagging unease crept into his mind. This wasn't over. Karen wouldn't let it go. And something told him this was only the beginning. The next morning, James Carter sat at his kitchen table, staring into his cup of coffee as the events of the previous night replayed in his mind. The confrontation with Karen, the way she had called the police without hesitation, the false accusations, he had expected some level of entitlement from her, but not outright fabrication. What unsettled him most wasn't just her audacity but the certainty in her voice, as if she had done this before and fully expected to get away with it. He knew one thing for sure, this wasn't going to be the last time she came after him. If she was willing to escalate things this quickly, he needed to be prepared for whatever came next. James grabbed his phone and dialed Eric Lawson, his longtime friend and an attorney who had a knack for uncovering things people didn't want found. When Eric picked up, James wasted no time explaining the situation. "Karen, huh?" Eric's voice carried a knowing amusement. "I've had at least 3 clients come to me about nosy neighbors with a superiority complex, but calling the cops on you for standing on your own property? That's a whole new level." James exhaled, gripping his coffee mug a little tighter. "I need to know who I'm dealing with." She knew exactly what she was doing last night. And something tells me this isn't the first time she's done it. Eric was silent for a moment before responding. "Give me a few hours. If there's dirt on her, I'll find it." James spent the afternoon trying to go about his day, but an underlying tension sat in his chest, making it impossible to focus. He had moved into this neighborhood for peace, yet in less than 24 hours, he had been falsely accused, humiliated, and nearly arrested in front of his own home. It was infuriating to think that someone like Karen had this much power, power she had no problem abusing. His phone rang just before sunset. "You're gonna want to sit down for this," Eric said, his tone more serious than before. "Karen has a history. A long one." James frowned, standing by the window as he listened. "She's been forced out of 2 previous neighborhoods for doing the exact same thing, filing false complaints, harassing her neighbors, and using HOA policies as a weapon against people she didn't like. And get this, she always managed to get onto the HOA board before things got really bad." James felt his stomach turn. So this isn't just her being a nosy neighbor. This is a pattern. "Oh, it gets worse," Eric continued. "One of her old HOA presidents left a public statement about her after she moved. She targeted specific people who, let's just say, didn't fit her version of an ideal neighbor. The reports she filed were always against the same types of residents, single parents, minorities, elderly folks who couldn't fight back. And every time, she'd claim she was just protecting the community." James stared out at his quiet street, anger rising in his chest. This wasn't just about last night. Karen had been doing this for years, and no one had stopped her. "Does she ever face consequences?" he asked, already guessing the answer. "Not really," Eric admitted. "She knows how to play the system. By the time people catch on, she's already moved on to her next target. She stays just under the radar, never doing anything technically illegal, but always causing enough trouble to make people's lives miserable." James ran a hand over his face, frustration simmering beneath his skin. He had been worried about dealing with one bad neighbor. Now he realized he was dealing with a professional manipulator, one who had perfected the art of controlling a neighborhood. And she was already coming for him. Later that evening, James took a walk around the community, feeling eyes on him as he passed. Some neighbors greeted him with polite nods, while others avoided his gaze entirely. He wondered how many of them had their own stories about Karen, how many had simply put up with her behavior to avoid becoming her next target. When he got home, he pulled up his laptop and scrolled through the HOA website, looking for anything that might give him insight into how she had embedded herself so deeply in the community. As he dug through old meeting minutes and neighborhood reports, one thing became clear: Karen wasn't just part of the HOA. She ran it. Her name appeared over and over, approving new rules, increasing fines, rejecting homeowner appeals. She had helped push out the previous treasurer, who had suddenly resigned with no explanation. Even more disturbing, she had spearheaded a policy allowing the HOA to fine homeowners indefinitely for violations that weren't properly resolved. James leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just about personal vendettas. Karen had turned the HOA into her personal weapon. He shut his laptop with a click, his jaw tightening. If Karen thought she could control him the way she had controlled others, she was in for a rude awakening. Because James wasn't going to be her next victim. He was going to be the one to stop her. The community center was packed by the time James arrived. Rows of metal folding chairs filled the hall, the air thick with murmurs and low conversations as neighbors exchanged glances, waiting for the meeting to start. He scanned the room, spotting Karen near the front, her posture rigid, lips pressed into a tight, self-satisfied smile. She had no idea what was coming. James had spent the past 2 days gathering evidence, speaking with former neighbors, and printing out copies of everything Eric had found: police reports, HOA records, and complaints filed against her from 2 previous neighborhoods. He wasn't just going to expose her. He was going to make sure she could never do this again. The HOA president, Rick Calloway, cleared his throat, calling the meeting to order. He was an older man, well-dressed, with a voice that carried authority. "All right, folks, let's keep this efficient. We have several items on the agenda tonight, so if anyone has a community concern, now's the time." James stood. Karen's head turned slightly, her expression neutral, but her fingers curled around the stack of papers in her lap. She was already preparing to dismiss whatever he had to say. "I have something to share," James said, his voice even but firm. "Last week, I had an encounter with a member of this HOA that I think everyone should be aware of." Karen let out a small, exaggerated sigh. "Oh, here we go," she muttered under her breath. Ignoring her, James continued. "Many of you may not know this, but last Thursday night, Karen called the police on me while I was closing up my own pool. She told them I was trespassing. She claimed I was acting aggressively. She even faked distress over the phone, pretending to be scared for her safety." A murmur spread through the room. "Now, I could chalk this up to a misunderstanding," James went on, letting his gaze sweep across the room, "except Karen has a long history of doing this exact same thing, to people just like me." Karen let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. I was just looking out for the community." James turned to Rick. "Can I pass these around?" Rick hesitated but nodded, and James handed off the first stack of documents to the people in the front row. As they flipped through the pages, the reaction was immediate. Whispers turned into gasps, eyebrows lifted in shock. James kept his voice steady. "What you're looking at are official complaints, police reports, and HOA meeting records from Karen's previous neighborhoods. This isn't the first time she's harassed residents under the pretense of keeping the community safe. She has a pattern of targeting people she doesn't approve of: single mothers, elderly homeowners, and people of color. She's falsely accused neighbors of theft, trespassing, and even reported children for loitering outside their own homes." Karen's face twisted. "This is slander," she snapped, standing so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. "You can't just..." James cut her off. "Actually, it's all public record. Anyone can look this up for themselves. And before you say I'm making this up," he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "Let's play a little recording, shall we?" The security footage played out over the speaker. The entire room fell silent as they heard Karen's own voice from the night she called the police on him. "I'll say he's aggressive. They always believe me over them." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people muttered under their breath, shaking their heads. Someone near the back let out a sharp, "Unbelievable." Karen's face drained of color. That's taken out of context," she stammered, eyes darting toward Rick, searching for an escape. Rick exhaled sharply, flipping through the documents in front of him, his frown deepening with each page. "Karen, this is serious. You never disclosed any of this history when you joined the HOA board." She scoffed. "Because it's not relevant. This is a smear campaign, and if you people are dumb enough to fall for it, then you called the police on my grandson last year." A voice from the back cut through the tension. All eyes turned to George Whitman, the elderly neighbor who had mostly remained silent during past meetings. He stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on Karen. "You told them he was trying to break into your house. He was walking our dog." Another neighbor, Lisa Bennett, spoke up. "You called animal control on me, claiming my dog was dangerous." "I own a Chihuahua, Karen. A Chihuahua." The room erupted as more neighbors started speaking at once, all their frustrations spilling out, years of false reports, fines, and accusations. Karen's gaze darted around the room, her carefully maintained authority crumbling before her eyes. She turned back to Rick, voice desperate now. "Are you really going to listen to these people? I was just doing my job." Rick set down the papers with an exhausted sigh. "Karen, based on this evidence, we have no choice but to launch an official investigation into your actions on this board. Until then, you are suspended from all HOA duties, effective immediately." Karen's eyes widened, lips parting as if to argue, but Rick wasn't finished. "Furthermore, considering the number of complaints against you, we'll be reviewing your enforcement of fines and violations over the past 3 years. If we find any misconduct," he glanced around the room, "you will be held accountable." For the first time, Karen had no response. The neighbors watched as she grabbed her things, shoving papers into her bag with shaking hands. She turned toward James one last time, her voice low with barely contained rage. "This isn't over," she whispered. James didn't flinch. "For once, Karen, I actually agree with you." As she stormed out, the neighbors erupted in conversation, the energy in the room electric. People clapped James on the back, thanking him, praising him for standing up. But even as he accepted their gratitude, he couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from finished. Because Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. And something told him she had one last move left to play. James woke the next morning to the sound of rustling paper outside his door. He barely had time to take a sip of his coffee before stepping onto his porch and spotting a thick envelope tucked into his mailbox. The moment he pulled it out and saw the sender, his stomach twisted. Karen Monroe versus James Carter. He let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head as he tore the envelope open. A lawsuit. Of course. The legal jargon was dense, but the accusations were clear: defamation, emotional distress, harassment. Karen was demanding $500,000 in damages for what she claimed was a malicious attack on her reputation. James scanned the pages, eyes narrowing at the claims, that he had incited the neighborhood against her, had spread falsehoods, had damaged her standing in the community. He almost laughed at the audacity. His phone was already ringing before he stepped back inside. "You're not gonna believe this," he said as soon as Eric picked up. Eric's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Let me guess. She's suing you?" James exhaled sharply. "How did you?" "Because this is classic Karen. When she loses control, she tries to flip the script. Trust me, she doesn't have a case." James dropped into his chair, rubbing his temple. Yeah, but she's making it a damn headache. The fact that she even filed this means she thinks she can turn this around. Eric clicked his tongue. She's not just trying to win a case. She's trying to wear you down. Make you pay for humiliating her. James already knew that. Karen wasn't interested in truth or justice, she wanted revenge. But she wasn't done yet. By noon, more letters arrived. A formal complaint from the HOA, claiming his home might be in violation of property regulations. A notice from a local contractor, suddenly alleging that James's pool wasn't up to code. The setup was obvious. Karen wasn't just suing him, she was trying to bury him. James clenched his jaw. He had fought hard for his peace, for his home, for his right to exist in this neighborhood without being questioned. And now, Karen wanted to take it away piece by piece, using every dirty trick she could think of. She had already lied to the police, manipulated the HOA, and called in every favor she had left. And if she thought for a second that he'd just roll over and take it, she was about to learn she had picked a fight with the wrong man. He called Eric back. Tell me we have something that'll shut this down fast. Eric didn't hesitate. Oh, we have more than something. We have everything. There was a note of excitement in his voice that made James sit up. Did some extra digging after last night's meeting, Eric continued. Figured if Karen's been pulling stunts like this for years, she's probably left a trail. And guess what? James leaned forward. What? She's not just a power-hungry HOA tyrant. She's a fraud. A slow smile spread across James's face. Tell me more. You know how she's been fining people left and right? Denying requests, pushing residents out? Turns out, she's been skimming money from HOA funds for years. Thousands of dollars, funneled through fake maintenance requests and bogus fees. She's been taking from this community the same way she did in her last two. James ran a hand through his hair, trying to absorb the weight of it. So she's not just corrupt. She's a criminal. Bingo. James could already see the next move forming in his mind. Karen thought she was untouchable. That she could rewrite the narrative, drown him in legal fees, and walk away clean. But now? Now, she was about to have everything she built ripped away from her. That evening, James called for a follow-up HOA meeting. He wanted every neighbor there. If Karen wanted a public battle, she was about to get one. By the time the meeting started, Karen walked in with her head high, a smug grin stretched across her face. She had convinced herself that she was back in control, that her lawsuit had sent a clear message. James stood at the front of the room, waiting for silence before speaking. Karen, since you love legal action so much, I figured you wouldn't mind us reviewing a few things. Karen's smile faltered slightly. I don't have time for your nonsense, James. Good. Then I'll make it quick. He placed a projector on the table and tapped his laptop, bringing up a series of documents. Let's talk about where all the HOA money has been going. Karen's face went white. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the real numbers appeared on the screen. $50,000. Missing. Bank transfers that led straight to Karen's personal account. Emails approving maintenance expenses that never actually happened. Karen's voice cracked. This is illegal. You can't just. James didn't let her finish. Actually, it's all public record. And guess what? The authorities are very interested in people who embezzle from their communities. Rick Calloway, the HOA president, cleared his throat and stood. Karen Monroe, based on the evidence presented, you are officially removed from the HOA board, effective immediately. Karen staggered back. You can't do this. Oh, we can, Rick said coldly. And we will be conducting a full investigation into your handling of HOA funds. Any criminal activity will be referred to the authorities. Karen turned, desperate, looking for support. But this time, there was no one left to defend her. For the first time since she walked into that room, Karen Monroe looked truly afraid. And James Carter enjoyed every second of it. James stood on his porch the next morning, sipping his coffee as he watched a moving truck pull up in front of Karen's house. Even from a distance, he could see the frantic way she stormed back and forth, barking orders at the movers, her face twisted with barely contained rage. The night before had been the final blow. The HOA had not only voted to remove her, but with the evidence of financial fraud now in the hands of law enforcement, Karen's carefully curated life was collapsing. She had spent years manipulating her way into power, terrorizing anyone who didn't fit her vision of the perfect neighborhood. Now, she was the one being forced out. News spread fast. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with James now approached him with pats on the back, murmured thanks, and even a bottle of wine from George Whitman. "You did what none of us had the guts to do," George said, shaking his hand. Others shared their own relief, their own long-held grudges against Karen's tyranny. Some laughed at the sight of her packing, others whispered about what legal trouble awaited her. But James knew Karen well enough to realize this wasn't just about losing her position or her home, this was about losing control, and that was the one thing she had never been able to accept. As if sensing his thoughts, Karen suddenly turned from her driveway, locking eyes with James across the street. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a sharp exhale, she shoved a final box into her car and slammed the door shut. No goodbye. No last words. Just the bitter acknowledgement that she had lost. James watched her car disappear down the street and felt the weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally lift from his shoulders. The nightmare was over. Or so he thought. That afternoon, an unmarked envelope appeared in his mailbox. No return address. No name. Just a single sheet of paper inside with a cryptic message: "This wasn't just Karen. Look into the HOA's real estate dealings. You'll be surprised what you find." James reread the note, his pulse ticking up. A warning? A clue? Or a threat? One thing was clear: Karen might be gone, but the corruption in the neighborhood wasn't. Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen in your life? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.